the issue of territorial concessions is the most controversial one because, as we know, Russia has not been able to occupy the rest of the Donetsk regions for over 10 years now.
A meeting between Ukraine's President Zelensky and US negotiators has been cancelled after peace talks in Russia ended without a breakthrough. The Kremlin said the amended peace plan was absolutely unacceptable and suggested Russia was ready for war if conflict began. But it also claimed it hadn't rejected the entire US proposal. NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels today. The alliance's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, told reporters in the last half an hour that support for Ukraine must continue.
We all want the bloodshed to end, and I strongly welcome President Trump's continued efforts to bring about a just and lasting peace. This is vital for resolving this conflict, and we support the United States in leading this effort. And as negotiations proceed, we cannot waver in our commitment to Ukraine. Every single day, Russian missiles and drones cause death and destruction, leaving civilians without heat, light and water as winter approaches. Ukraine's security is closely linked to our own. Our support must continue unabated to help Ukraine defend itself today and deter tomorrow.
That's the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Joining us now is Jaroslava Barbieri, Research Fellow at the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. A very good afternoon from us. Where do you find yourself this afternoon on the spectrum of hope and despair?
Good to be with you. I mean, as many observers have pointed out, this really feels like a Groundhog Day. We've been here before. I believe that very few of us believe that we would see a strategic breakthrough in Moscow, because it's very clear from a number of statements coming from the Kremlin over the past few days that Russia's maximalist demands regarding Ukraine have not changed, although all parties need to signal this attempt to make progress and be negotiators in good faith. However, all parties' red lines have not really changed.
Just talk us through what the key territorial sticking points are and whether or not you think that there is ever going to be a negotiating table around which Russia and America can sit with Ukraine watching on, or even at the table eventually, that an agreement could be reached on.
President Zelensky has stated publicly that the issue of territorial concessions is the most controversial one because, as we know, Russia has not been able to occupy the rest of the Donetsk regions for over 10 years now. And that missing part of the territory actually includes a belt of 45 cities that so far have helped Ukrainian forces stall any Russian advances. And therefore, also from an international law perspective, it's inconceivable that Ukraine would have to cede territory it still holds. However, Russians are sort of trying to win this territory back the easy way. However, it's very important to see that both Kyiv and its European partners are unambiguously emphasizing that this is a non-starter and any territorial concessions of this sort are red lines. And so any conversations about potential territorial concessions must start at the current front line.
What is life like in some of those 45 cities this winter?
This winter is looking quite gloomy for millions of Ukrainians as Russia continues to strike critical energy infrastructure. And this is a strategy that we've seen Russia consistently playing since 2022 in an attempt to frustrate morale, both among the Ukrainian military and the wider civilian population. However, this in a way reflects the continued misunderstanding from Moscow of Ukrainians' willingness to resist. Too much have been sacrificed so far for Ukrainians to give in. And so a lot is at stake, and President Zelensky and his European partners are fully aware of this. What matters is the extent to which they will be able to keep the US on board, particularly when it comes to procuring key weapons that only the US can procure, particularly sophisticated air defense system that Ukraine is critically need, as well as intelligence that allows Ukraine to continue its strikes deep into Russian territory to undermine its ability to continue and wage this war.
And what are your thoughts about that continuing relationship and support between the EU and America?
I believe that also this is a consistent strategy from Moscow to try and drive a wedge between Washington and Brussels, as we've seen from recent statements from the Kremlin, attempting to portray Europe's emphasis on its own red lines as being the uncooperative and stubborn party, trying to undermine the so-called Trump deal, which actually was a Russian draft, effectively. And also the most recent statement that it's supposedly Europe being the warmongerer, trying to undermine ongoing attempts to solve the so-called Ukraine crisis, as Russian officials refer to the full-scale invasion, to really shift away blame from Moscow to Ukraine and the Europeans. And so the European leaders are trying really to navigate this very difficult balance between keeping the US on board for as long as possible, but on the other hand, being fully aware of the fact that they need to take serious steps towards strategic autonomy, because it's unclear how wide this rift within the transatlantic alliance could become.
Sure. I mean, sometimes it does feel, Jaroslava, doesn't it, as if we hear many forceful words coming from different parts of the EU. We hear forceful words coming from NATO, but it doesn't move the situation on at all. The EU, though, does appear to have reached a provisional agreement to phase out Russian gas imports by 2027. Do you think that that will mark a change? I mean, is that a significant lever?
Overall, a key problem that Europe has faced is that it has put itself in a reactive position, sort of trying to postpone or delay, prevent a worst case scenario from happening out of the actions promoted from Moscow or Washington. The recent decision to phase out fully imports of Russian gas is, of course, welcome. However, we're talking about 2027, and also all broader conversations about bolstering its military capabilities. Also, the time frames mentions are quite far away. So all of these decisions point to the fact that Europe is moving into the right direction, is dawning on European leaders the scale of the Russian threat. However, the scale of the response needed, I believe that Europeans are still struggling to take the kind of decisive action that they need, precisely because they're still fundamentally dependent on the US for its security needs.
Yeah, and how long do you think it's going to take for Europe to actually really look at its situation, look at the reality of its situation, not make that lean towards America? I mean, the American administration could not be clearer over the last 12 months about what it doesn't want the EU to look to it for.
I think that one important thing that the Europeans are continuing to do in order to keep the US in the game is to take full advantage of the Pearl system, the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, which is a mechanism that has allowed NATO's European member states to continue purchase US equipment that under the Biden administration was being provided for free. And so in a way, European leaders are providing the Trump administration with a commercial incentive, as cynical as it sounds, to keep the US on board and not fully transition towards an openly pro-Moscow position, which, as we have seen, is the proclivity of the Trump administration. Because on the other hand, we see that Moscow, in these different sort of renewed rounds of negotiations, is really trying to normalize US-Russia relations and trying to incentivize the Trump administration to adopt a pro-Russian stance on how to end the war as a potential entryway for commercial opportunities that would be to the benefit of both Moscow and Washington's. And so Europe's attempts to tap into this transactionalist nature of the Trump's administration is very uncomfortable for both Europeans and Ukraine, because this war has, of course, a moral dimension, but that is the strategy currently being adopted.
Absolutely. And the moral dimension is so important, isn't it? I was watching the news last night with my 18-year-old daughter, Jaroslava, and we watched President Putin warning Europe that Russia will be ready for war. With that smile that sometimes plays across his lips, the rest of his face has stopped moving. It hasn't moved for a while. But she turned to me and said, are we going to be at war? And I suddenly thought, am I wrong to say to her, no, we're going to be okay? And actually, I hadn't really thought that thought before. But do you think I will come to regret my reassurance?
I mean, this is the tragic feeling that many parents have already felt in Ukraine, and this tragic feeling is now coming to a number of European families. Now, a confrontation between Europe and Russia might not look quite like what it's looking like in Ukraine, but we've seen an increase in the so-called grey zone activities with Russia's incursions into NATO airspace, with Russia's spy ships sort of mapping out our undersea cables. So all of these escalatory behaviors point to the fact that Russia really has a potential of escalatory behavior towards Europe. And so we need to take these words seriously. And we have seen recently a number of European countries exploring different models of voluntary or mandatory conscriptions, precisely because they need to shift away from this peace mindset and accept the fact that the peace that we have secured in Europe is not something to be taken for granted. It's something, it's a value that we need to be ready to fight for.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to talk to you. That is Jaroslava Barbieri, Research Fellow at the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House.